Okay, hello and welcome back to part 2 of the lecture. This part is about Arthur Miller, and I want to set him both against Elizabeth Gaskell but also compare him with her as a writer whose texts participate in the same tradition of writing about the Salem witches, and this is the section of the module that comes on to consider Salem as a major theme in witchcraft fiction over the years. So I want to compare them and contrast them, but I also want to move on to thinking about Miller's own context in the 1950s and how things have changed since Gaskell's period about 100 years before. Miller then is born in 1915 and lives until relatively recently, until 2005. So he has a long lifespan, longer than that of Gaskell. And during the course of his life, many things change. And you can see the way that this is reflected in his work. He comes to the module as a Jewish writer specifically, and he thought about himself in that way, although he was a broadly secular Jew. But he had a Jewish upbringing, an émigré Polish father and an American mother. So we're talking here about an interestingly mixed identity, an immigrant identity, and yet also an American identity, an identity that is torn between religious positions and secular positions, and one which of course encounters during the course of his lifetime the Holocaust, the mass murder of Jews across Europe, which had a massive influence, as it did on most Jewish writers. It would be hard to find writers who were not traumatised, were not influenced by that terrible event. He married Mary Slattery in 1940, then Marilyn Monroe in 1956, and finally his third wife Inge Morath in 1962. So this is a man who is much married and much divorced, and that again is something that was unthinkable in Gaskell's period. Things have changed religiously, things have changed politically, things have changed in terms of gender politics. And of course we're also looking at witchcraft from the viewpoint of a male writer rather than a female one. So there are some differences here that we need to think about. Miller has 4 surviving children, and his major works are from about 1947, so that immediate post-war period, to about 1955. It's a short period of intense productivity, and of course he carries on writing works thereafter. He's one of the major American playwrights of the 20th century, and that carries right on throughout the course of his life. But really the period when he really establishes his reputation and becomes most important is the late 40s to the mid-50s. And his works include All My Sons and View from a Bridge and many other plays that I'm sure you'd be familiar with, alongside the one that we're looking at, The Crucible. Miller again encounters injustice in his world as Gaskell did, and so again I want to compare these two writers. For him it was specifically political injustice. He is a very political writer, and political in the kind of narrow sense of the word. So yes, he's interested in social questions, and as we shall see, he is to some extent interested in race and gender. But he's really interested in high politics, in the politics of parties, in the discussion groups around political issues, in fighting for certain kinds of rights for American citizens. And this tends to be around the balance between left-right in American politics. Still a contentious issue, of course, but in his period particularly so. In the 1950s, the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, was set up by the House of Representatives and the Senate to investigate communism. So there was a specific concern that America was being infiltrated by communist spies, primarily from the Soviet Union, but also from other communist backgrounds. And that communism was going to spread across Europe after the war. The Iron Curtain would come down, the Berlin Wall would come down, but instead of what actually did happen in the 1990s, that instead communism would sweep across Europe, and ultimately it would take America as well. So there is great concern in American political circles about this. This is broadly paranoia, but at the time it must have felt different. You can imagine the great conflict between different models of thinking about the world, capitalism on the one hand, communism on the other, and the sense that there was a deadly battle to be fought between them. In 1952, Miller's friend Elia Kazan names some of his colleagues to HUAC as communists. So writers would be called up in front of HUAC, writers, people from the army, people from other professions, and they would be questioned about whether they're communists or not. And Kazan named some of his colleagues as communists, something that caused Miller to fall out with him. He thought his friend had done completely the wrong thing, that he should not have given names to the committee, that he should not have, as it were, confessed, and he should not have named others. And this caused Miller to think about the Salem witchcraft trials as a model for what was going on with the House Un-American Activities Committee and its chairman, Senator Joseph McCarthy. So this is McCarthyism, which I'm sure you'll have encountered in your reading around this section of the module. Miller was questioned himself in 1956, so this is after he has written The Crucible. He's convicted of contempt of Congress in 1957 for refusing to name others, but his conviction was quashed in 1958, by which time the American political system was starting to think that McCarthyism had been a bad mistake and that the emphasis on communism had severely distracted America from the real problems that lay in front of it, particularly the civil rights movement. So they were thinking, we've been focused on the wrong thing here. The threat is not communists. The threat to our society is actually prejudice and discrimination. We need to do something about that. Of course, this is something that still is going on in American politics, and insufficient progress was made in this period quite clearly. So this is a period of intense political conflict, and Miller is at the heart of that. He thinks about the Salem witch trials as a metaphor for McCarthyism, and he's been doing that since before Kazan's trial by the committee, but it sharpens very specifically when Kazan is questioned. And Miller was already interested in this kind of political work. His plays usually deal with what would have been called in Puritan times cases of conscience. So cases in which a good person had to decide what to do, had to decide how to respond to a particular situation. Miller, as a Jewish writer, was really interested in this Puritan art form. So in a Christian art form, an American Christian art form pioneered by English Puritans who then emigrated to the United States as it later became. But he was interested as a Jewish writer specifically because of thinking about the Holocaust and thinking about what it is that good people can do about terrible evil flourishing in their world. He applies all this to thinking about the Salem witch trials. And we'll come back to thinking about that in the seminar. But of course, as I've been saying, there were other injustices flourishing in American culture at the time, and the most obvious of these was racism. In the south part of the United States, separate but equal segregation laws were in force. Of course, this meant separate but not equal in practice, and it was broadly being recognised throughout the late 40s and the early 50s that this was the case, that this was a profound inequality and something ought to be done about it. In wartime America, black workers were employed alongside white ones in the defence industries. The armed forces were integrated in theory. So when American troops came to Britain to prepare for D-Day and the invasion of France in 1944, they were supposedly all part of one army. But in practice, there was segregation. Black troops and white troops were put into different units. They were expected to perform different tasks. Black troops were mostly assigned to logistical and engineering tasks. And the two were literally segregated, so they could not go to the same pubs and dance halls. They were not expected to mix outside of their basic duties as army soldiers. This led to riots in Britain, and it's encouraging and good, I think, to see that quite often English people intervened on behalf of the African Americans. There are some really interesting cases across the southwest. There's a particular event in the little Devon town of Newton Abbot where there's a big fight in the streets over black troops' access to a particular pub. So it's a fascinating moment for English culture as well as for American culture, the Second World War, and the impact on racial understanding and racial misunderstanding actually is really interesting. So segregation is in process throughout the Second World War, but when the black troops go back to America after the war, one of the first questions that they rightly ask is, well, we fought for our country, why are we being treated unequally? Why are we still living in a segregated society? The President's Committee on Civil Rights was established by Harry S. Truman, who was then president from 1945, as a response to this move towards wartime unity, but the tragic mismatch with actual events. But he was also responding to the 1943 race riots, which had started in Detroit. There were a number of cases once it was realised that the president had set up this commission, but that he could not take the whole country with him. There were a number of cases through the American courts which focused on demolishing the idea of segregation and pointed out particularly that it meant inequality. It was not separate but equal, it was separate but unequal. The important legal challenges that you will want to know about are from the 1940s, Shelley versus Kramer, 1948, on housing. George McLaurin versus the Board of Regents. This was at the University of Oklahoma in 1950. McLaurin had to fight for admission to that university. He was then provided with separate facilities, and then finally he was allowed to integrate when he continued to contest this injustice. The NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People, an organisation that still exists today and is still fighting for the rights of African Americans, then brought further cases throughout the 1950s. So in May 1954, for example, closing down the McLaurin case, eventually, a judgment effectively forbid educational segregation across the sector, so from higher education through to primary education. And this was when Oliver Brown took the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas to court, arguing that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal, after his daughter was refused admission to her local school. So there are a whole range of civil rights legal cases. There are also, as you will have seen, there were marches, there were demonstrations. Individual citizens stood up and said that they would no longer accept the separate but equal legislation and that it was not equal. So race is a really important context for reading The Crucible and other works of this period. Sex is also an important issue in this period, both sex in the sense of sexual activity, but also in the sense of gender. American women were not granted equal voting rights until 1920, which is, I think, important to know. In some ways, America, although it presents itself as a liberal democracy, as a society of equals, has been notably lagging behind other democracies in granting voting rights to individuals and granting civil rights to other individuals. Again, it's the war that prompts some of the realisation that this needs to be caught up. From 1941, when America enters the war, American women served in the armed forces. So they worked in military hospitals as nurses, they worked in munitions factories, they worked in auto repair shops, they drove trucks, etc. But after the war, and I'm sure you'll know this from your understanding of popular culture, they were basically expected to return to their homes and become good housewives. They did not wish to do this in large part. Of course, for some women, this suited them. For others, it certainly did not. And there were other agitating factors within American society that forced Americans to think about gender equality alongside racial equality. In 1953, the Kinsey Report, Sexual Behaviour in the Human Female, caused an absolute outrage across American society because it described women as having sexual agency. And it described for the first time the female orgasm. It's often credited with having discovered the female orgasm. But even so, it was not until 1965 that in all of the American states, America being a federation of state laws, as you all know, that in all states married couples could legally obtain contraception. So things were not changing as fast as they should for American women, and there were many American women who stood up against this. Witches begin to be used as a metaphor for feminism in this period, much less associated with race than in later periods, and we'll come on to looking at that as we go through the course of the module, but most definitely from the period of the Second World War, associated with sex and sexuality and with gender and the equal rights of women. They become a metaphor for discussing the status of women in American society. So, for example, and we'll look at some of these texts later on in the module, the film I Married a Witch from 1942, which I'd recommend that you have a look at. Bell, Book and Candle, a play from 1950, made into a film in 1958. I'd recommend you have a look at that one as well. So here are some of the big issues that swirl around Miller's play, The Crucible, both before, during and after its writing and its subsequent writing up and its performance in different contexts. Miller writes extensive notes, as you will have seen, for the play, and it mutates over the course of time. So it starts as a stage play with simple dialogue. It moves on to become almost a kind of novel in its own right because he writes such extensive notes. And the vast and quickly changing landscape of politics around the Crucible is what prompts him to write those notes, is what prompts him to think this through. And the Crucible does become one of the kind of philosophical works of American culture of the mid-century, if you like. So I want you to move on to the exercises now. Please think about how much Miller focuses on the question of race in his play. What about Tituba? What kind of a character is she? How is she set up? How much is she blamed? How much is she exonerated? We're thinking back to the portrayal of Natty and the other Native Americans in Gaskell's story, and we're thinking forward to the depiction of African Americans in the future in the course of the module. And we'll talk about Tituba's racial identity, her ethnic identity, in the next section of the lecture. But for now, think about how Miller portrays her. How much does he focus on gender too? What about Abigail particularly? How much is she a victim? How much is she a villain? And what about the other women who serve as foils to her? Elizabeth Proctor particularly. How are they portrayed? And finally, let's think about historical accuracy, going back to the overarching theme of the module, which is about historicism, is about realism, but about the way that activism and romance cut across that realism. Miller's note on historical accuracy is very silent and very vague about some of the historical matters behind his play. We know that he made significant changes. Just have a little list of what some of those are. Just start to think through where he is historically inaccurate and think about why he might have made those changes and whether or not they matter.